All right. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us again today for improving your giving and receiving feedback skills. I'm Calvin Landrum with the Corporation for National and Community Service in Washington, D.C., and I'll be the host for today's webinar. I'll also be facilitating the live Q&A at the end of this session. Also joining us are Jessica and Indy from our partners at Education Northwest, who have helped to prepare today's webinar and will be managing the WebEx technology. You'll also see them in the chat and the Q&A to help address any questions that you may have during this session. Now, today we're going to be talking about obviously giving and receiving feedback. We're going to talk about the types of feedback, offer some tips on giving and receiving. We're also going to be discussing difficult conversations, strategies around how to hold them, when to hold them, and then we'll recap, provide you with some resources, have our closing and evaluation, and finally, our Q&A session where we'll open up the lines and you can ask us any questions that you would like. Now, I'd like to welcome our main speaker today, Mr. Mike Beebe. Mike decided to take his passion for leadership development and training and start Leadership for Change training and consulting in 2004. Since then, he's worked with thousands of individuals and groups to help develop their leadership skills. Mike has over 25 years of experience managing youth and adult leadership programs and is passionate about partnering with individuals and organizations to create positive social change. And Mike has also been a part of a national team of VISTA trainers and facilitators, and we're happy to have him as our key presenter today. Some of you may have even had him at your own PSO. So hello, Mike. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Calvin, and hi, folks. VISTA's serving across the country. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, really glad to have you excited to hear today's presentation. So I'll let you take it away and get us started.
Thank you, Calvin. I'm grateful for this opportunity to support you in all your efforts to fight poverty. The art and skill of giving feedback, and we need both art and skill in this, I believe are critical not only to our success in fighting poverty, but also just as an ongoing life skill. As we were prepping this, we're like, well, what do we mean when we say feedback? Well, any information we get about ourselves is feedback. How we learn about ourselves from experiences and other people, how we learn from life. We're getting feedback regularly. I got it just earlier when I was driving to drop my kid off at school and might have cut in front of someone a little too quickly and got a honk. We get feedback from our families regularly. We get feedback regularly in the workplace. It's not always offered up in the most helpful ways, and sometimes in quite negative ways. Our hope is that this webinar will give you some strategies to give feedback that is constructive and helpful to both you and who you're giving feedback to, as well as getting better at receiving it. A few tips that, and we'll talk a little bit about some things that get in the way of receiving feedback. First, we always like to hear a little bit from you to give context, and I'd like to hear about your experience giving feedback. You'll see a chat question here, and we encourage you to use your chat box. I saw you all using it earlier here, that we've got folks that have been serving at various points in your service. What are some situations where you've had to give feedback in your VISTA role, whether you've been on for 3 weeks or about to finish up? I bet some situations have already come up for those who are early on, and I bet you've had a lot of experience doing this for those who've been serving a while. So go ahead and type in the chat box. And Calvin and I will read some of these out, and we'll try to get as many out verbally as well as you can read what's coming in the chat box.
Yeah, they're coming in kind of fast and furious already. Situations where you have to give feedback in your VISTA role. I'm seeing while reviewing documents.
Last week, my staff and I had to complete our winter evaluations. Okay, and that went scrolling up the screen. Mostly in training so far, all right? Yeah, the way things are organized.
For a supervisor at work, that's a big one. I think a lot of us has run into, having to give feedback to their supervisor on a wide variety of topics and subjects.
Well, I like this saying no to colleagues when I have other priorities. I hope you've gotten good at that.
Yeah.
Oh, feedback to me from our organization president. Now we're going to talk a little bit about power and positional authority later, so that will.
Yeah, weekly meetings, providing data analysis, So what I'm seeing here is feedback is coming in a lot of different forms over people's VISTA year, from their supervisor to their supervisor, in staff meetings to coworkers to clients to volunteers that you're working with. It's a really big part, of VISTA service.
It is very helpful by way of getting context of status of a grant proposal via teleconference, directly with youth, 14 to 18-year-olds. I have actually found it easier to give and receive feedback from youth than I have adults. Probably not everybody shares that belief on this call, but most of my background's in youth development, and there's something refreshing about how willing youth are able to let you know when you're messing up, but also when you're doing things well. I bet a lot of you are working with you. How to ask for feedback without allowing someone to cut you down. Okay, well, good. We've got. You can keep typing in. This certainly helps me by way of context, and I'm feeling more and more confident the tools will be helpful as I see the situations you're dealing with. Staff surveys. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for your putting into the chat box the situations where you've given feedback. I'm glad you're getting a lot of good experience doing that. We wanted to ground ourselves also in some common VISTA situations, not only the ones that you typed in just now, but some common things we hear, and often literally in these words, you'll see in these word bubbles. So I'm being asked to do work that is not appropriate for my VISTA role. That is super common. Folks, I've been a VISTA supervisor and supervised half dozen VISTAs myself, and know that I place members at other sites, so it's one of those multi-site projects, and I know that often my VISTAs were being asked to do things that weren't really within the arena of their VISTA assignment description, and so that's something I had to kind of coach my VISTAs to get good at, as redirecting when they were being used for roles that weren't appropriate. I appreciate the trust my supervisor has in my skills. So we do hear, we want to get better at appreciating, and so we're going to talk about that today as well. I have many supervisors I'm not sure to take direction from. Yeah, you as VISTAs are set up to have a lot of supervisors. Some of you have a site supervisor, and then you have a project supervisor, and then you interact with folks from the state office, maybe even from the VISTA member support units. You've got a lot of people that have higher positional authority than you and are trying to give you direction. So hopefully I'll give you some tools to manage that better. The other VISTA member on the project is not doing their part. Okay, common when we work in teams, right, to feel like sometimes we're taking on more of the work than others, and want to know how to have that conversation about dividing the responsibilities more evenly. My supervisor makes comments that are offensive to me, and I don't know how to handle it. It's especially difficult when that offensive comment comes from somebody who has a higher up position than us, and so we'll talk a bit about that today too. So we're hoping to offer some approaches to dealing with these situations by utilizing best practices in giving feedback and in holding difficult conversations. So we'll go to the next slide here. In terms of giving feedback, I'm drawing a lot of my inspiration and information from a book called Coaching Skills for Nonprofit Managers and Leaders, and they divided it into these three categories or skills that we need to work on to get better at giving feedback. Again, I want to remind people the definition of feedback. It's any information you get about yourself. In the broadest sense, it's how we learn about ourselves from experiences of other people and how we learn from life. And that definition I'm grabbing from another book I like called Thanks for the Feedback. You'll get this list of resources at the end of the presentation, as well as in a bibliography format. We are working on on feedback, though, where we're going to directly give it through using some best practices like what you see in front of you, rather than the indirect feedback that we get all the time, and sometimes direct and not offered in the most positive framework. So real quickly, objective observation here is the foundational skill. It's getting better at checking our assumptions and biases and sharing what we see or hear. And that acts as a foundation for both appreciative and developmental feedback. Appreciative is often thought of as positive feedback. Developmental is also thought of as constructive criticism and offering feedback when we'd like to see a change in behavior. I have found this framework, as I said, very helpful in guiding me to be more effective in communication, both as a supervisor. I know some of you are not supervising volunteers and their staff, but also tools for communicating or coaching up to my supervisors and to my peers in the workplace. And then I'll also say I find this helpful at home with my 5-year-old daughter and my partner. So we can use these both personally and professionally. We are focusing on your role as a VISTA member today. But know that you can try this out at home too. It's a good place to practice. Moving on to the first, a little bit more detail on the first skill, objective observation. It's literally articulating what you see without interpretation, evaluation, or judgment. This is actually really challenging. It's human nature to just interpret, evaluate, and judge right away. We jump right to that. And often we're hired to do that because we have good skills at interpreting and evaluating, and that's why you were hired to do your VISTA position. But we'll get much more effective at both giving and giving feedback when we start with the observation and separate that out from the interpretation or evaluation. Again, easier to be clear on this through an example. So as we look at the next slide here, imagine you are, well, we have somebody in a meeting that's being a little bit, taking up a lot of time. An evaluation, this is an example of an evaluative comment, could be a comment or a thought I have. Harriet has been talking too much and taking up too much time in the meetings. So if we look at this if we were to change this evaluation statement into observation without evaluation, what I literally see or hear is that Harriet spoke 5 times during the last meeting in comparison to other staff who spoke once or twice. I've also noticed she spoke an average of 4 minutes while other comments were 1 minute or less. Okay, even as I read that, I say, wow, that's a lot of words and seems a bit much. But I think it's important to realize that evaluation, and Harriet's been talking too much, is just that. I might think she's talking too much and someone else in the room might not. And especially if I'm trying to give Harriet that feedback that you're talking too much, her perception of talking too much is probably different than mine, given that she's spoke 5 times and for 4 minutes at a pop. And so it's going to be easier for her to understand how I came to that interpretation if I'm really clear about what actually happened, what I saw or heard. And also, it checks me on it, right? Maybe others don't feel she's talking too much, so I can at least name the behavior that led me to that. Otherwise, we kind of get into debate mode. So let's move to the next slide, which is tips for objective observation. We'll first focus on the person's behavior. And again, we get specific and note exactly what that person said or did, as we did in that last example of Harriet speaking many times for many minutes. Ask yourself, would other people see or hear what I saw or heard? This kind of then gets us clear on what's my perception versus what's the reality. Pretend you're taking a video of that person, then playing it back. What would you actually see or hear? This is a good reality check for us as well. And then if we're giving the observation, we're sharing that with someone, we say what we observed without judgment. And then it becomes a conversation. This skill, objective observation, is the foundation for both appreciative and developmental feedback. We start with the observation, and now what I want to start with is apply this to appreciative feedback, or often what we would call positive feedback. But in this model, we're calling it appreciative feedback. First, I'd like to share this quote. People get on average only a couple of minutes of positive feedback each year versus thousands of hours of negative feedback. I like to believe, I don't know if this is true in your workplace, but I like to believe in the nonprofit sector and the folks working to fight poverty that this average is a bit higher than that. But you may have had this experience where you get a lot of negative and not a lot of positive. This is from the book Quiet Leadership by David Rock. So I do think if we focus on giving both specific and appreciative feedback, that we're going to see better results from our volunteers, from our interns, from our staff, from our management, when we can focus on amplifying strengths. And so we're going to start there. And let's look at a model for providing that feedback, or a formula, if you will, on the next slide. So it's just this, observation of the behavior. We start with that objective observation. We separate it out and then also offer an appreciation of the positive feedback, or the positive impact, I should say. We're working on positive feedback right now. And that observation plus the appreciation then equals, hopefully, supporting and encouraging the current behavior that was going so well. Let's look at a specific example of how to use this formula. Well, first, actually, I realize this would say, let's look at how we often hear it in the workplace. I've been guilty of this, just to say, great job. I say this in the workplace, I say this at home. Also, or nice work on that proposal. They're well-meaning, and I don't mind hearing those things myself, but they're not real specific. In fact, I wouldn't actually know necessarily what specifically I did well in either case. And so the more specific we can be, the more effective our feedback is in reinforcing those positive workplace behaviors and ultimately in helping amplify their strengths, allowing us as VISTA members at our sites to increase the capacity of our programs by amplifying strengths. So let's look at a specific example now. Taking one of the earlier VISTA situations mentioned, imagine you're a VISTA working at a youth after-school mentoring program, and you want to make sure your volunteers are appreciated. Here's an example of using the appreciative feedback formula to give feedback about something you saw that you thought was great. So one, start with the observation. I noticed you said hi to each youth as they arrived at your after-school program. So you're thinking to yourself, what positive action, behavior, or demonstrated quality did you observe? So you notice that the person said, the VISTA said hi to each youth as they arrived at your after-school program, or a coworker or a volunteer. Let's look at the next step. So reflect back on your observation based on facts. I saw smiles on young people's faces and excitement to get started on their projects. Even that word excitement might be an interpretation, by the way, so I'd want to be, what I would say is that those smiles are the sign of excitement, maybe the literal physical movement to get started. So now you've created an acknowledgement, I see you. And then the third step is communicate what this is where the impact comes in. Communicate what the behavior means to you or the impact that it has made to the team, project, or organization. When you add this appreciation to your acknowledgement, you give meaning to that person's behavior. So for example, I greatly appreciate how your greeting of each youth creates a welcoming climate for all youth and creates an environment where they can build community and do good work on their projects. So a high level of specificity that allows that person then to receive it and think about, okay, this is what I'm going to continue doing. I'm going to continue warmly greeting my youth in my program as they come in. Then we're moving into developmental feedback. So often this is what we all get nervous, including myself, about doing when I have to do it. So it helps me to have a formula in this case. The formula and appreciative feedback I don't feel like I need as much, but it helps me think about being more thoughtful. And in developmental feedback, I need it to actually reduce my anxiety. So I like this formula. Again, observation plus impacted behavior, and then finishing with asking for a request for the future. So in this case, I've taken the example of this is supposed to be the voice of a VISTA talking to their supervisor. We're going back to that example of what some folks might have experienced. You get drawn into direct service more than perhaps you should be as a VISTA volunteer. So in the example here, the observation is John. John would be the supervisor. I noticed that I've been directly tutoring youth over half my time at the tutoring center for many weeks now. The impact and separating that out, and I say I'm concerned that if I'm spending so much time directly tutoring members, and will not have the time to build our capacity to tutor more youth by recruiting more volunteers. And then finishing with a request. Should we make a plan together for me to reduce my hours gradually doing direct tutoring so that I can carry out the responsibilities in my VAD, or VISTA assignment description, of volunteer recruitment? No, I wouldn't say I would rattle this off formulaic style. I would say we do this as a conversation, and that perhaps even in just sharing the observation, John might not have realized that you, or the VISTA member in this case, was doing over, maybe half their time tutoring. And so they know, oh, then they work on that solution together. That's ideal, right? When they get what you're sharing and they agree with you. But then if they, don't, then this is a good formula to rely back on. Let's look at what we're ultimately aiming for in that word bubble there at the bottom, change in behavior and improved outcomes. So again, recommend do this as a conversation. And then here are some tips for helping your feedback go well. One, we're posting to the chat a link with handouts that include a worksheet you can use to prepare for a conversation. It literally walks through those, what's your observation, what's the impact it has, what's the request you want to make. And I do, for some of those more scary conversations, recommend really scripting it out. And then as you are, as you're in that conversation, to refer back to that at a glance, not to be reading off a script, but it's helpful to just make sure you cover your points. Check your attitude. Can you set aside anger, resentment, frustration that you have? If not, you might want to wait until you can. As I thought about this one preparing for today, I said sometimes when we communicate our frustration and show a little passion about it, it can help get results. But I think if it's so, if you're so frustrated, so angry, that perhaps it's hard to even get your words out, or hard for you not to just move into yelling mode, or then that's the time where you might need a pause or a break. I think wonderful when you can ask permission to give feedback. It prepares the person. One, they can say no, and if you do ask permission, you have to prepare they might say no. So one, it gives them option to say no, and maybe they can then hear it later. But also, if they say yes, then it kind of creates a joint ownership of, okay, I've agreed to hear this, and I may do something about it if I find your feedback helpful. Address one issue at a time. It's overwhelming for someone receiving feedback if you bring up multiple issues. It's also probably unlikely that they could respond to each and every one of those issues. So I pick the most urgent when there are many, and it might be that there are many with some folks where you're giving this kind of feedback, but pick the most important. As much as you can, stay away from blaming. That this should be a conversation, by the way, that their reality probably is different than yours, and it's, again, focus on the behavior, not character assassination, hopefully, and that we're really trying to get a change in behavior that gets better results. And then stay on track. Again, that kind of refers back to the one issue at a time, but this is about, the issue at hand, and to keep it to that. Check it out. Again, there are two sides to every story. Do have a conversation, not a lecture. Ask their perspective on it. And then finally, let's help the person move forward. Do leave with some tangible steps, next steps both will take. I often, if I haven't made a specific request, sometimes I just ask the question, what is it we can both do to move forward? What are some specific next steps we can take? Okay, I've been talking at you a bit. I'd like to hear from you all. Give you a chance to talk through what you would say in this particular scenario. We're going to go back to that example. I imagine some of you face this. You've been in your VISTA position in this scenario, we're saying, for 3 months now, and while you know that some direct service is appropriate for VISTAs, you're concerned that you're doing more direct service than capacity building. You decide to have a conversation with your supervisor. What could you say to your supervisor when you have your next check-in? I am willing to put money on the fact that some of you are dealing with this right now. As someone who supervised VISTAs and trained VISTAs, I know this comes up quite frequently. So we'd love to hear from you. You can either hit *1 on the phone if you want to actually have your voice out on the webinar. We'd love to hear it, and our operator will be able to open your line. Or you can type your answer into chat, and then I would love to hear it. Again, *1 if you want to answer verbally, or you can type your response in the chat box and we'll read it out. A question here. Does he have someone above her or talk to her? Okay. Yeah, we could go
to something in the chat.
I'm just plugging into the chat. I was so focused on what I was saying. Okay. It could have maybe applied, though.
Yeah, honestly, yeah. Let's see, I'm trying to, that's a really good point while we're waiting on those responses to roll. And, checking to see if someone does have, maybe you could talk to someone, above them. Brendan says, really stress the VAT, I would say. And I think that's an excellent, excellent advice, VISTA and your state office and us as an agency really will stick by what's in your VAD. And if you're being asked to do things that are not in that VAD, while there is some flexibility, direct service is like kind of not one of those flexible zones. So that's one thing you can bring up and say, hey, this really isn't outlined anywhere in my position description, in my VAD. Can we, talk about course correcting this? Can we see what other activities I can do that are in line with the work that I'm supposed to be doing? I think that, there's definitely a way to go about that without causing conflict.
Yeah. I see someone applying the tips. Ask permission to give feedback, then just say your concerns. Ask what other VISTAs have done in the past, and if you are the first, say you want to work together to fulfill your VAD. A very partnership approach. And I did see some saying my supervisor doesn't care. I'm sorry for those who have that situation. That does happen.
Like Jamie says, like a really good quote here, hey, supervisor, do you think we could review my VAD to ensure that I'm on track and doing what I'm supposed to be doing? I think that's an excellent way to open that conversation.
Yeah, I kind of recommend a quarterly, if not even more frequently than that we're looking back to that VAD. State my observations of this behavior and could state concern impacting term of service. State how much time you spend doing direct service versus indirect. What other activities or responsibilities can I do? Make plan to for further and to ensure stay on track with a new plan. Yeah, that seems to mirror what I was recommending earlier. Thank you.
Yeah, I really like Helen's response. She says, clarify what your roles and responsibilities are as listed in the VAD. As listed on the VAD, stress that you have indirect service talents and skills that you feel can be tapped into for the betterment of the agency. I really like kind of relating it back to, hey, I'm actually really good at doing the things that are outlined in my VAD, and I think I could be more beneficial if I was working on this, as opposed to sort of doing this over here. This is what I was hired to do, and this is where my skill set lies. I really think, that we're missing some potential here. And also someone saying, hey, if you don't mind, I will come up with a proposal for how I can spend my time that will focus more on the building. I think that relates back to sort of those tips that we had of, come with a solution, and, if it's really easy, to kind of go to your supervisor and complain and say, hey, I'm doing this direct service, we need to fix this. But if you have some like tangible steps, if you can think of the other activities, if you can kind of remove yourself, step back, and think of the broader picture and say, instead of doing this, I could be doing this, this, and this. Can I start working on these projects, that I'm proposing? It really helps your supervisor, I think, ease into that conversation as a, sort of as opposed to having to come up with something on the spot and say, oh, okay, well, I don't know what you can be doing. Let's talk about this later. If you come with those suggestions, I think that's definitely a really good tactic.
Here's one from Cadence that we looked at my VAD and went through what was necessary for me to complete it and came up with solutions. This is mirroring kind of what you were saying, Cal. Here, additionally, I met with my VISTA leader, group supervisor, and site supervisor to come up with solutions. So an example of utilizing all the various people resources around you. We also worked out how the direct service I do is valuable for my VAD so I could reframe it and not feel frustrated with it. And certainly, the direct service is invaluable to the capacity building work you're doing. I say this in training over and over, that if I'm going to write a grant about the great work we're doing, what better way to feel the passion around it and understand the importance of it, but to do it myself, just that you don't want it to be a majority of your time, because then we'd be not doing capacity building. And she said, goes on to say, this helped my enjoyment at work and helped me able to gain insight on how the work I'm doing is valuable for creating sustainability and building capacity. That looks like one for the quote books.
Yeah, cool. All right, shall we move on?
Yes, let's move on as we have more good stuff to cover. Thank you all. You can keep typing things in, and as we're able, we can comment on that. And then I'll encourage you in the future, think about actually using the option to talk. With a couple hundred people on the phone, sometimes that's intimidating. So as we move ahead, we're actually having another chat question. And we're switching gears from giving feedback to receiving feedback. As a kind of lead into this, one of the books I'm recommending is called Thanks for the Feedback, The Art and Science of Receiving Feedback. And their whole notion is that we got to get better, if we want to get better at giving it, we got to first start with ourselves and get better at receiving it. I know you VISTAs get plenty of feedback, and so you're getting a 1 year getting good at it because you got it. But I wanted to say, think of a time. This probably won't be a hard question to answer. Think of a time you received feedback that was not helpful, and then kind of the name. What about it? What about it was it that felt unhelpful? Part of why we want to do this is that sometimes looking at our own situations, we can get better at both receiving and giving. If you think about this also, what did the other person do or say that was unhelpful? What was their tone? Other nonverbal communication, remember? Where were you? I'm being vague, not specific enough, yeah.
Like one of the first responses is getting contradicting feedback from 2 different sources can be extremely frustrating, for sure, especially if you're kind of running into that situation where you feel like maybe you have more than one supervisor and one saying go this way, one saying go the other way. You know, I understand that would be really frustrating.
Absolutely, yeah. Not clear, not specific. Again, this is why we're really focusing in on how can we be more specific, both in terms of appreciative and developmental. More in terms of personal feelings that they had about me.
So they felt embarrassed in front of colleagues and peers. That can definitely be a situation that you run into, especially if feedback is given in a venue or a forum that is maybe not appropriate. You know, it's like, hey, instead of, and I think that's one of those things where you can have a conversation and say, hey, I really appreciate this feedback and I'm going to take it to heart, but next time, you know, can maybe we discuss this as a private matter as opposed to in front of in front of the entire team.
Feedback that is just commenting on the situation rather than giving feedback that could improve the performance. Again, yeah, that pairing, we don't want to just make the observation and then explain the impact, but we need to be thinking about, well, what is our request? And so in that case, I might suggest, ask, okay, well, what are you requesting here? Or might I offer some options?
But my supervisor emailed someone else and CC'd me saying that my work had no personality or brand. Yikes. Yeah, that's uncomfortable. Sorry to hear that. But at the same time, I hope that you were able to sort of take that, as blunt as it was and maybe as incorrect as that forum was, as maybe a bit of feedback inside of there to say, okay, I understand that, like, I didn't like this, that was kind of rude, but maybe I could work on that. You know, like, it's, yeah. I know it's hard to try to turn something like that, you know, into a positive, but for some people, you know, that is their way of giving feedback, for better or worse. Body language and tone of voice are important. This is what Carol says, for sure. There's some really great responses, everyone.
Yeah, my supervisor heavily critiqued a draft report as if it were a final piece of work. I thought I made it clear that it was still in the beginning stage and was frustrated that he didn't listen to my description of where I was in the process, and or that I hadn't made it clear enough, and then he was frustrated that he thought I did low-quality work. Yeah, again, reiterating that the communication struggles happen on a regular basis. Well, I'm thinking move into the next piece we're going to talk about is this, you know, art and skill of receiving feedback. And again, this is a book is a really great read. I'd recommend people pick it up. You can get it from your library. I actually checked it out digitally myself, but you can get physical copies as well. What they explored in this book, they interviewed thousands of people, and what they explored is what were things that got in the way of people receiving feedback. And certainly you listed a bunch. You know, folks' tone can be difficult. They can be very generic, and so there's not enough specificity. Or they can observe things then without making a request. You don't really know what they're wanting, but you're hearing that something's not right. So certainly people can get better at giving it. But the whole notion of this book is that, okay, we're going to get some messages in some difficult ways, and we can certainly, you know, give feedback on how to give it better, but that there are some common barriers that come up for us, and you're seeing the 3 that they distilled it down to. And this is based on their interviews with thousands of people. And the first barrier is this, imagine these quotes. These quotes are like the voice in my head, right? And so I get a piece of feedback, and one of the barriers they saw come up often in these interviews was that I just simply think it's not true. The feedback's wrong, unfair, and unhelpful. The first example that came to my mind, because I do like to ground these in real-life examples, is actually in the home, not in the workplace, but you can translate in this workplace pretty easy, that my partner will sometimes tell me, well, that was rude. And my first response, because I'm not a rude person, and no, I wasn't rude. I was just telling the truth, you know. So in other words, then it stopped me from actually figuring out what was rude. And we're going to talk about how to move through these, but to note, first thing to do is note the trigger. What's getting in the way? One is I just simply don't think it's true. And what they would suggest in this book is that we then see if we can get to a place of being curious about it. I'll share more about that in a moment, but I want you to hear these triggers first. The other is depending on the relationship, it can be really hard to hear feedback from a particular person. So the voice in my head says, I can't hear this feedback from you. You know, I've got a number of people in my life that I have real good, strong, trusting relationships with, and they could give me really critical feedback, and I would take it in because I have this strong, trusting relationship. The situation that came to mind was a former employer of mine. My favorite supervisor ever got fired, and I thought for some unjust reasons. And after that supervisor left, I found out the next day the person I was going to report to was the very person who fired him. And so you can imagine I had some resistance, especially to getting feedback and direction from this new supervisor. And so that in that moment, the voice was, yeah, you could, I'm not even able to hear you because you did something that I thought was so wrong. What I'll tell you is later, and again, as we move, how we work with these triggers, but later I are actually quite a wise supervisor, and I learned a lot from her. I still didn't agree with that particular decision, but I did end up learning a lot from her. But the initial block for a while, and why I had a more trusting relationship, was that I just can't hear it from you. And then identity, the voice in my head around this is feedback is threatening and I'm off balance. The example I'd share here is, I make my living as a facilitator and trainer. So sometimes when I get constructive criticism or developmental feedback using the language that we used earlier in this webinar, on my facilitation or training skills, I do feel a little threatened because it's my living after all, and I pride myself on being skilled at it. And so I can be thrown off balance by that and not be able to hear the often really valuable feedback because that trigger comes up. So let's talk about how we work with these triggers and move through them to actually learn something from the feedback that's being given to us, no matter how they're being delivered. And it sits in this place of, can I move off that voice of that's wrong to tell me more? Literally, that line works really well for me a lot. In the case of being called rude by my partner, what I often will say when I'm able to take a breath and not jump into defensiveness, which sometimes I do. Sometimes we probably all do, but sometimes I do that. And if I could take a breath and say, well, can you tell me more about what you meant when you said rude? What did I say or do? So you see, I'm taking that earlier skill around objective observation, and then I'm asking the person giving me the feedback, in this case my partner, I'm asking her, what did I say or do that was rude? Well, I find when I ask that is that indeed she was right, that the thing I said or did, I could see, at least her perspective, how it could be perceived as rude. And so it's helpful for me to step back. And then ultimately, I win. We all win from that, in that I am able to then, okay, I can see my tone was really sharp, or I can hear that the words I use could be considered rude. So I can change the words, the language I use. Again, in those other two examples, with that supervisor that I didn't have a trusting relationship, it was more about relationship over time, but I'll tell you, I had to breathe a lot and also then really step into this question, can you tell me more about your suggestions for program improvement? Because that's a lot of what she had to offer. And in the end, actually had excellent suggestions for program improvement, but I had to keep asking questions. And then the third scenario around identity, in my work, I do get feedback on what I do day in, day out, and I would add something to this slide that we didn't type in here that I have come to believe, and I keep telling myself this even in the hardest feedback moments, that feedback is a gift, that when I can hear it and ask this question of tell me more about that I'm going to become much better at my work. And ultimately, we're here in VISTA, we're aiming to fight poverty. In my training and facilitation work, a lot of my work is about supporting people to fight for social change. And so if I can get better at what I do, ultimately we're more successful at creating positive social changes in a world that so desperately needs it. So I think of that feedback being a gift, even when it's not delivered the most delicately. So I did want to get a little more specific on the next slide here about an approach to asking for feedback that can help create a more of a feedback culture. This is a name one thing approach, and I'm grabbing this right out of that book. Thanks for the feedback. And it literally it's like, can you tell me one thing? You can see the delta symbol there. What's one thing I could change that would make a difference to you? So this could be a conversation with a coworker. It could be a conversation with my supervisor. It could be a conversation with volunteers that I work with or youth that I work with. One thing, they say one thing, is because it's easier for the person that I'm asking it to think of one thing. It's also easier for me as the person asking for, in this case, what I call developmental feedback, to integrate it and to do something about it. If you give me a laundry list of things, I shut down because I'm just overwhelmed. Similarly, the person giving the feedback would probably have a hard time coming up with a laundry list of things. So the name one thing approach. What's one thing I could change that would make a difference to you? Or ask, what's one thing you see me doing that is working well for you and our team? So asking for that appreciative feedback, too, is very valuable information for me. And I have been using this over and over in my work and in my home life, and it's made it better all around. So try it out. Name one thing. Maybe you're already doing it and found this working. And then we want to leave you, as we move out of receiving feedback into doing a little practice here, we'll leave you with one last tip. If you move to the next slide, please. Our hot tip is, if you haven't already discussed with your supervisor how you like to receive feedback, immediately put that on your to-do list. You know, this isn't much of a news flash, but when I do these workshops in person, I hear over and over from people like, I didn't actually think to communicate that. And my supervisor didn't ask it. So any of you are in a position where you're supervising folks, you can ask this: how do you like to receive feedback? And so here, let's look at some things we thought about as we're like, okay, sometimes I ask this question, people are like, well, I don't know. Well, timing is everything. So are there better times of day for you? Morning person, afternoon person? Do you need time to think about things, or you prefer feedback given right away, like in the moment? In person versus in writing, do you like to get the verbal feedback, or you would rather have it in an email or a text or somehow typed up? Or, you know, again, it's going to depend on the situation, I'm sure. It's much easier to get a positive comments in front of people and in person, but you might want those in writing for our records, right? Or one-to-one versus in a group setting. A number of you mentioned like being given negative feedback or developmental feedback in front of a group, and so you kind of felt like almost your authority was undermined, or it just felt embarrassing, right? And so you can make requests. Can you, to the extent it's possible, can you give me, can you give me the feedback in a meeting later? Or some of you probably don't mind it, and so if you don't mind getting that in a group setting, it's good for them to know. And sometimes that feedback can then benefit all, and it's not just about you; it's about the team. Direct versus indirect. You like it, just no beating around the bush, as they say, but it's like getting right to the point. I know there's geographical differences around this, and there's sometimes cultural differences around this, but you know, when I'm working with East Coast folks, they tend to be just much more direct, and sometimes I find that hard, but sometimes it's refreshing because I know exactly what they want. Us Pacific Northwest folks tend to be accused of being passive-aggressive, meaning a bit indirect. So sometimes we're giving feedback and we don't even know what feedback is being given. So I think this is a style issue, and so communicating what works better for you. Sometimes folks like to get feedback paired with something they see us doing well, and so if you like that, ask for it. So again, good to get aware of maybe you haven't thought about this question, so start thinking about it and then relaying to folks around you how you like to get feedback. Let's move into our last component of this webinar, which is holding difficult conversations. Certainly developmental feedback, which we talked about already, can be one of those difficult conversations. It's not always, though. And so I found it helpful, and we have found it helpful to think about, well, what are the components of holding difficult conversations, and when is it time for one? Well, on this slide, as you'll see, where there's strong disagreement, emotions are running high, and it's important to all. So those three things are present. It's my clue that, yes, indeed, it's time to have one of those difficult conversations. When those three components are present in a conversation or situation, it's human to feel stress. Madi has one of three involuntary responses to stress: freeze, fight, or flight. Often these responses emerge from childhood. For example, people who freeze often had dominant people in their lives when they were children, and they get a brain freeze in the face of strong emotions from others. Others feel the same stress but respond aggressively, and others might just walk away. Fear is the primary reason why people avoid difficult conversations. Learning to manage those difficult conversations is the key to solving problems both professionally and personally, and to being a good communicator. When emotions run high, we often don't want to look bad. Managing the difficult conversations requires self-awareness, an ability to speak authentically, an ability to listen without judgment. So we're going to look at some tools and think about also hopefully heighten our self-awareness a bit about what would help us manage difficult conversations better, practicing using I statements as a first step to overcoming the anxiety. Let's look at often, as I said, fear is what comes up when we think of having a difficult conversation. We wanted to ask you, what kinds of fear comes up for you in difficult conversations? For example, fear of, what is it a fear of? What consequences might people be afraid of? So I'll look to you for your thoughts on this. What fear comes up? Okay, fear of disappointing my host site. Yes, fear of being disliked.
Ruin the relationship. I see that one. That's definitely been a personal fear of mine for sure.
Fear of getting fired. That's just being real, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That fear lies there, especially when we're not in a position of positional authority in an agency. Fear of being misunderstood. Fearing incompetent. Yes. Fear of offending people.
Rejection, misinterpretation. Yeah, I think a lot of this comes up too. I mean, especially if anyone here has ever worked on a team, you know, and it's like you really respect your coworkers and your teammates, but you know, maybe if you need to have that conversation with someone, you know, it would be really uncomfortable because you have to see them every single day. You have to talk to them and face them every single day. And if you feel like you're not doing it right, or if you say the wrong thing, you could mess that up forever. I would say most people are able to take feedback a lot better than I think we give them credit for, and that's sort of something that I've learned. As you know, if they do have to tell something that I've observed, as long as it's objective and I'm not, you know, cutting them down or being personal, they're able to take that. And it might be, you know, a little awkward for the hour afterwards, but they always come around, and you know, and everyone's better for it, I think.
Fear of just my own reaction, positive, negative emotion, and just being aware of what goes through our heads can help us.
Totally. I really like Sergio said, fear of not making an impact, that people might be afraid of being judged. I think that is also a scary thing, that you're going to say this thing, it's not going to make any difference, and then you've said it and nothing happened, you know?
Yeah.
Nothing, you know?
Right. And I was going to speak to this later. I'll just speak to it now. I think in those moments, sometimes I may not get the result I want in terms of having the conversation, but at least I'll be in my integrity, meaning that if I feel something strongly that needs to be said, at least I've said it, and I wouldn't know if there would be a good result or not if I hadn't said it. Now I may know, and then I have to live with that if people don't hold themselves accountable. I see a lot of people saying things about accountability and fear that they won't respond. Fear of lying. People might just tell you what you want to hear, and then that nothing changes. I might have heard that from a couple bosses over the years. And that happens, yeah. All right, well, let me share a few, just what I had on my list of fears that can come up. I think it looks like we probably hit them all, but fears can include loss of control. Need for a high level of control is usually more about the need for safety. A person experiences feeling was conditioned to need to do things, him, her, themselves to be safe. Need for control can be overwhelming. So control is a big one. Fear of chaos, disempowerment, invisibility, rejection, abandonment, hurting others, retaliation. Folks mentioned that with the firing, right? Fear of anger. And you'll see the slide we just put up, and again, another time where we want to hear from you. We thought it important to acknowledge the power dynamics. We've been saying things about it throughout. Often as VISTAs, you don't have a lot of positional power. It depends. Some organizations are flatter than others. Some are smaller than others, and so you step into a lot of power if it's a smaller organization. But some of you are stepping into large organizations, and one power dynamic might just be that lack of positional power. But I'd love to hear, see your comments on power dynamics. And I put in the chat box, I think, where we're going to experiment here. Is this where we experiment with annotating, right, Calvin?
It is.
Okay, and then you can also unmute yourself, *1, if you want to share it aloud. And we're going to, annotating means Calvin's going to actually type in some of your comments under the slide, I believe, and be able to see it a little bit more easier than in the chat box.
Yeah, I gotta change.
Invite people. Yeah, how do power dynamics impact your ability to have difficult conversations? That was my coaster for my water bottle that you just heard. Maybe you didn't hear it. And I called attention to it.
I'm seeing setting unrealistic deadlines. You know, if that's your supervisor and they're setting these deadlines for you, for sure, it's like, oh, can I like speak up? Like, let's see. Not having enough power.
I mean, an older person, fear of age discrimination, and the age discrimination is taken differently. Yeah. And I know in my work I've seen that go both directions with younger and older. Some of you are young adults, I imagine, that feel like you face some age discrimination from folks that are maybe in their 30s and 40s. But that's how age discrimination plays out. It's the old and the young.
Yeah, retaliation.
This comment, I'm just a volunteer. You know, I sometimes do conflict resolution, and that very line was used to describe a VISTA. You'll be all pleased to know that I had them reconsider the just the volunteers, but we don't always have those advocates out there saying that really minimizes VISTA volunteers when we use lines that way.
Totally. You know, opinion, not setting appropriate boundaries. I think that's a really important one, I think. Like and sort of boundaries and power dynamics sort of butt up against each other a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
Some said, lots of work due too soon.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, and that might also be a thing. Like you've been assigned so much work that you don't even have time, you know, to have these conversations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cynicism.
Yeah. I wonder if that's our own. I'm guessing that's about cynicism of others that you're working with, but we can run into our own too, right? Especially if we've been on the other end of that power where we've been disempowered, disenfranchised, or discriminated against. We can run into our own cynicism about people's ability to change.
some people don't even realize I'm a college graduate and not an intern. This misunderstanding makes me wonder how they view me and my work. Definitely. I think that is a distinction, and I know that that's really hard for some VISTAs that they run into of sort of being seen as an intern in their office and not a fully fledged, individual, like capable of, doing great, like full-bodied work.
Being perceived as an entitled millennial. I am firmly in middle age now, and I can't tell you how often I'm hearing this from my middle-aged peers. And what I do, I use that approach. Can you tell me more what you mean by entitled? I feel like what we're hearing is something we've always said about younger adults. Like this is a recycle. But that's just my perspective on this. But that's certainly, if that phrase is being used in your workplace, that's certainly a minimizing comment, and is, I think, a way that, that age power, generational power is playing out.
Definitely, and someone put in the comments, they said, when we talk about tell me more, like you just brought up, when you say tell me more about that, how do you feel about that, you really start to get deeper into those issues once you ask sort of enough, and you really get to the root of what that person means when they say entitled, whether it is a specific behavior that someone exhibits. It could even be as deep as a specific person in their life has a behavior that they don't like, so then it gets applied to an entire, group of people. But you don't know that unless you're asking those questions and kind of digging deeper and trying to take as little offense to that as possible.
Yeah, I think back to that, the objective observation tip, and can I ask questions that really get at, well, what did you see or hear that led to you thinking so-and-so's entitled?
Definitely. All right.
Playing detective.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. So we're going to go ahead, just to keep us in time, we're going to move on to our slide number 35. And
we're going to ask you another question. So what strategies have you used to address these power dynamics? We'd like to, again, this is kind of, we're mining you for your wisdom as you're the ones serving and experiencing these dynamics as VISTA volunteers. What strategies have you used? I already see some answers. Deconstruction of the problem.
Definitely. And in the interest of time, I'm going to say everyone go ahead and put those in the chat so we can keep rolling and get to our final Q&A in time.
All right. Okay. Clarifying expectations with a supervisor. Allow the supervisor to take the lead. Okay. Sometimes you just have to swallow your pride and speak up. Check myself first and keep positive thoughts. Walk through fear, whatever it is. Yes. Back off and reproach. Being direct and tactful. Okay. Remember the shared goal. Talking to the superior of issues and resolve. That's good to keep in mind that, sometimes we do have to go above to deal with a bad power dynamic. Okay, I'm going to move us into, and I'm going to probably keep watching the chat box. I'm liking a lot of what I'm reading here. Thank you. Strategies for starting a difficult conversation. One, use I statements. I'm going to offer up one model for I statements in a couple minutes here. Speak to be heard, not to change minds. This seems a little counterintuitive. As I get hooked on changing someone, I often am not as effective at communicating what my viewpoint is, and I'm also, ironically, not as likely to actually have them change their behavior. But if I speak to be heard, one, I'm in my integrity, I get my message out, but then also probably more likely to be able to engage in a conversation. Two, express your needs and ask for theirs. So again, engage in a conversation, not a lecture. And then often we'll find the underlying needs are similar. It's just that we see the behaviors attached to those needs as a little different, and that's often where the conflict is or the difficulty. So do ask for theirs. Make reasonable requests. That's relative, right? You are going to know best what's reasonable in your situation, or maybe your colleagues will. If it's gotten so difficult, it's hard for you to see that. So finding your allies in the workplace, finding your trusted confidants that you can kind of assess what would be a reasonable request. But do make a request, because that will help someone know what you need to move through this or move forward. And then best you can refrain from judgment, knowing that you're in a difficult conversation for a reason, and you're human, you have judgment, but how can you put that aside to engage in a conversation and have some hope that there's a way through it, and that will be more likely result in something that will work for both of you, both parties, or a team if it's a team situation. Moving into a specific model for I statements on the next slide. Offer this one up. There's also a book called Nonviolent Communication that has a slightly different, but I use this when you begin with I feel, you take responsibility for your own feelings by stating next the behavior that is a problem for you and then the consequences for you of that behavior. You're not directly blaming the other person, but rather highlighting the actions which are an issue for you. And then closing with an invitation to discuss the situation further, expresses openness to listen and work together. So let's say, put an example on here, again, makes it more real. Let's take the situation mentioned earlier about working with another VISTA that isn't doing their part. Imagine you're having a conversation with that VISTA member. It might go like this. So the first step, I feel frustrated when I had to do most of the in-kind donation asks for our upcoming auction. I made most of the calls and the pickup of items. It makes me think, so I know we're separating our feeling and the behavior from what we think. Makes me think you don't care about the success of our project, and I'd like it for the next event if we can split the test evenly and for you to follow through on yours. Again, this would be a conversation, and that I wouldn't just rattle through these like a recording, but I would be in conversation, and then I would share. This would be roughly the sequence that I would share it in. I'd want their perspective, and hopefully they'd be using I statements as well. Well, what did you feel and think? What was your perception of how that auction played out? And then be able to name the behaviors that made you think that they weren't doing their part. Good communication skills such as these enhance relationship building and problem solving, which are key to making your service productive and rewarding. Let's move into another scenario. Your supervisor, we're drawing.
We're actually going to skip that scenario so we can get to our questions. We've got a few queued up.
Right. Yeah. Good. Good. We've had good interaction in the chat box with them. Let us further in our time schedule. Great. Let me highlight these resources real quickly. I've referenced them already. Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. Great one for really exploring how to use I statements, both personally and professionally useful. And actually, each of these are. Thanks for the feedback, Science and Art of Receiving Feedback Well. That's the one all about receiving feedback. And then Compass Point is a good clearinghouse for resources and training focused on nonprofits. They're out of Oakland, so those of you in the Bay Area in California can actually go to their in-person trainings. Don't know that they're offering webinars, but they also have a lot of great books and online articles and resources through the website listed there. And then I think we'll move, I'm going to hand off to you, Calvin, to talk about evaluation here.
Yeah, for sure. So we are almost to our sort of Q&A portion. We have a few questions queued up, and you'll be able to call in and ask us over the phone also if you have questions. But our evaluation is going to pop up at the end of this. Please take a quick few moments to share your feedback on this presentation. This is our first time presenting this webinar, and we'd really like to improve it for you all if we decide to present it again. Again, I read every single comment that you all write, and we try to improve based on that. So when you see that pop up, please help us out and take that for us. It'll be up throughout the end of the presentation. Now, we know that we've given you a lot to think about. There has been a lot of really good discussion in the chat, and we have some questions queued up. Again, if you have any questions, please place them in the Q&A box so that we can get to those. I'll also ask our operator to let us know how to ask questions on the phone.
Thank you. And at this time for questions from the phone, again, press *1. Please unmute your line and record your name. Again, press *1, please.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, Mike. So I've got some questions for you. So we're going to see. I don't want to try to stump you, but we're going to see, what we can do for these folks that have their questions. So So Michelle says, I've heard that most employers don't care about what feedback is given at the end of an employee's time. Should we keep our final feedback professional and minimal, or be honest about our experience?
Well, I'd be curious about the source. I mean, I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of organizations that I've worked with that probably don't take that feedback seriously enough. However, my recommendation is that we kind of go in with this mindset that they are going to take this into account, and that I kind of owe it to the future employees of that organization to certainly be as constructive as possible, but be real about the challenges you experienced, if that's the frame, right? They probably love hearing and taking into account all the positive feedback, but I think of it as a gift to the organization, and it's going to be up to them whether they see it that way or not. But know that there's one trainer, and I know there's actually more than one, but I am advising organizations to invite feedback as much as possible from their employees and act on it. Because I know a lot of you said in your experience, like, you're worried you won't act on it. I said, this is where integrity is built for you as an organization. You need to act on the feedback that you get. You need to believe folks, too, that their experience is what they say it is.
Yeah, totally. And, you know, and I can speak on behalf of VISTA. I know whenever VISTAs are done with their service, they do like an exit survey, and we here at the headquarters level, I mean, we look through all of the responses, every single one. We pour over them, try to, you know, pinpoint things where we can actually take action. The good comments are good too, and we love them. But what's most helpful is when people, you know, give us suggestions for tangible change, and they give us those suggestions for training when they tell us, hey, this wasn't working at my site, you know, this is the experience that I had. I think I would say most people probably are receptive to that feedback, and I think it might be like a misperception that most employers don't care what feedback is given, because people love hearing about themselves. They love knowing how they do. They love talking about themselves, and by some extension, you know, their organization is themselves, especially when that feedback's coming from an employee. So yeah, I think you should, you know, be honest about your experience, and I think there's a way to be honest and also respectful.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. So Virginia says, I'm in a position where volunteer leaders in our English program have tension between them. Should I try and mediate? That's interesting.
Again, hard sometimes when we're not on site to hear more about what the tension is. I do think a third party can be helpful in some situations. And there's something powerful about just having a third party witness and hear each other and being neutral on it, and that would be the key too, that I'd ask myself if I could be neutral, because if you can't be, you might just deepen the divide, so to speak. And so the mediation, and if you know mediation skills, a piece of it is really taking time to hear what their underlying needs are, and giving both parties an opportunity to share those needs, and that will often surface if there is a shared way through. And so certainly, again, not knowing exactly how you work with them day in, day out, but if you're someone who has the trust of both of them, you could be a valuable neutral third party.
Yeah, that's a hard one without knowing the sort of bigger context of this conversation. You know, and I agree. You know, when I was doing AmeriCorps, I was an NCCC team leader, and I had my team. You know, and sometimes one person would come with me with a complaint, another person would come to me with a complaint about the other person. And I think it did help in some situations, you know, to kind of be that middle ground to say, to sort of bring these people together, sort of say, hey, you know, you're having this issue, let's figure this out. You know, and to kind of, you know, be the person that can kind of check both parties and say, hey, this is, you know, maybe this is getting out of hand, or you know, can kind of de-escalate a situation if it gets like, you know, if it gets wild. So yeah, thanks for that question. Let's see. Brandon Patterson says, what do you do if the person you're talking to is absolutely unwilling to be positive and construction when giving you feedback? I mean this in general, but they've just known a few people like that before. You know, what do you do if that person is absolutely unwilling to be positive and constructive when giving you feedback?
Well, I began to know that about the person and take take that as I'm hearing that feedback, know that is a way that they show up. And so I think for me, the self-messaging I'm giving myself is, okay, this isn't personal. This is something about them. I probably don't say that to them because it probably escalates that behavior. So it is about, okay, asking myself, what do I have control over here? And do what I have control over. If it is creating a toxic work climate, then I am beginning to start to think about, okay, I've tried talking to them directly. Is there someone else I can talk to? Either someone in a position of similar power to them, or perhaps it is to talk to their supervisor or someone in HR, depending on how toxic the environment is getting. And I've got to be strategic myself, depending on where I sit in terms of my positional power in the agency. If it's something I can just manage and just know that's about them, and I'm still able to do my job, then maybe that's just what I do.
Definitely, I feel that, and I've also known people like that who are unable to give constructive feedback or positive feedback, and the second I realized that, I kind of stop taking that person's feedback seriously because I know that if I take it seriously and take it personally, then I'm going to be offended. So rather than be offended, I'm just going to say, I can't take this seriously, because X, Y, Z, because this is not constructive. At a certain point, sometimes I think it can just be kind of berating and degrading, and you're like, this is not what I need. So I would maybe not seek feedback from that person, ask someone else who you trust and who has maybe demonstrated that they're capable of being objective and giving you, good and constructive feedback.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So thanks for that question. Let's see. Helen says, oftentimes employees, volunteers, et cetera, do not feel comfortable giving feedback to their supervisors. How can you create a culture where they feel okay to give you feedback? How can you really know how you're supervised if not from who you supervise? And I'll start by saying, Helen, that we do have an entire webinar on this. I don't know if you were there for the Managing Up presentation that we have, but I think a lot of that, has to do. And Helen, I'm not sure from this if you are a supervisor or if you are or if you're a VISTA, but managing up is a big part of that. I think one of the strategies that we mentioned was the 10-10-10 format of of your meetings, where it's 10% about, hey, this is my feedback for you, 10 minutes or 10%, 10 minutes of, hey, what feedback do you have for me, and then 10 minutes of, okay, let's plan to move forward from this. I think like having some structure can help you create a culture, where it is okay to get feedback because you're setting aside a space, for that feedback. It's not incumbent on the VISTA or the volunteer or the employee to come to you with that. You're sort of opening that forum and saying, hey, I'm here, I'm showing up, I'm ready to receive whatever feedback you have. I think that is one step that can go a long way. What do you think, Mike?
I think you've said it. I think creating that space that's just a regular, makes it a habit, is good. And then I always refer back to that name one thing that I've both formally and informally asked people, tell me one thing that's getting in the way, or tell me one thing that how I could better support you. Especially I'm seeing Helen's a VISTA leader. I'm hoping she's asking that question a fair amount, like how can I better support you? Tell me one thing. It also helps the receiver of that to, okay, well, I can think of one thing. Often I'll get, if I just do a big open-ended question, it's like, oh, no, you're doing great. When really I have some thoughts, but I can't distill it. I don't know how to distill it down. That name one thing helps me think about how to distill it down.
Definitely. All right, so let's see, what do we have? So Alicia asked a question, and I'm going to ask you, Mike, because maybe you do have tips. I'm not able to speak to this topic, but maybe you do. She says, can we discuss how depression and anxiety come into play when giving and especially receiving feedback? I asked her some follow-up, and she said, sort of how anxiety and depression can be a struggle for some, especially receiving feedback, understanding the differences between constructive and non-constructive criticism is cloudy, especially when something important is on the line or power dynamics exist.
Yeah. Well, I think probably, I didn't catch the person who wrote it, but probably all too familiar with this, if, or I've worked with people who are familiar with it, but just knowing that, people in their lives have trauma they've experienced that may have led to anxiety or depression, and I think it would do us all well in fighting issues of poverty to have information on that. And I think something that can come up, particularly in those feedback moments, is that this goes a bit beyond sort of identity, relationship, and truth triggers, that it triggers past trauma. And so sometimes we can be having a conversation with people and they literally aren't, they're hearing somebody else other than themselves. It might be their mom or their dad or a past employer that talked to them negatively, and that like baggage comes up, in other words. And so I think for the person on the receiving end that has anxiety, depression, that just that encouragement to keep doing your own work on whether that's to actively be in therapy or to have, a support group, or in some cases, some folks benefit from medication that help them manage that. That doesn't mean, that doesn't let people off the hook for also getting better at giving and receiving feedback. And when I say that, I think when we practice that tool of grounding ourselves in objective observation, I'm just going to keep repeating that, and noting the difference between observation and evaluation, we're going to help folks be able to hear and receive feedback better if we're grounding it in things that we saw or heard and not in our interpretation, because it will be much more easy to digest. There could be a whole webinar on this and a whole day training for that matter, but I would be seeking out there. I know in Seattle we're offering, where I live in this home, and major urban areas are offering a lot of interesting training on trauma-informed care. And I think we need to bring that into our, our feedback giving, and know that people have past trauma that they bring in, and often not our role to dig deep on that, but just to understand that sometimes when people respond defensively, they're responding from some past challenge they've had. And have empathy, really, is what I guess I'm saying. Yeah.
Definitely. Thanks for that, Mike. That's really great. Before we get to some of the other questions in the Q&A, I do want to go to the phone and see if we have anyone on the phone.
Currently, we're showing no questions from the phone. As a reminder, parties may press *1.
Thank you. All right, so I do want to address this question from Brandon. He says, what tips do you have for getting people to understand and respect identity triggers as described in these slides? For example, their feedback is maybe racist, sexist, homophobic, or transphobic in nature. When not taking it seriously doesn't seem safe. And I know, Mike, you've done work, with like the LGBT community before, so maybe you can speak to this a little bit.
Yeah. I increasingly think I'm glad that this is of increasing value to organizations too. I think it is important to have outside training and internal training on, I often what I hear come up a lot in the workplace is microaggressions, which are kind of common daily language or offensive comments that are made that are, if you look at more closely, often the people making them don't understand that they're racist or sexist or homophobic or transphobic, for example. And so we need to take it upon ourselves to keep educating ourselves from the places that, and I'm going to do a whole training on this, but the places where I've had privilege. So, for example, I, as a white person, have not experienced being insulted and torn down and denied jobs and whatnot based on my racial identity. And so I've got to it's incumbent on me to learn more about how racism impacts folks of color, for example, in the workplace, and know that I need to respect the language that they'd like me to refer to them by, and also to educate myself on by going to trainings and being in a relationship with peers that can advise me on how to be a better ally, to connect with others across identities. So that ongoing education, I would hope your workplaces are valuing that and offering that. Now, there are great online resources for these things as well. So one that comes top of mind along race lines would be Color Lines as an online media source that has a lot of good opportunity to educate. So what I want to read, I'm reading this too, what tips, getting understand respect identity triggers. And so I think we do need to set up spaces to have explicit conversations on this. This is harder in the moment if we're not doing that work on creating a culture about understanding intent versus impact, because a lot of folks will say, well, I didn't mean anything by that, and then not understand that they had some pretty serious impact on the person depending on what was said. And so we have to create conversations within our agencies about what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior. I would go back to the I statement, though. If I experience a racist or sexist comment or homophobic comment or transphobic, to name it and say, when, take the, I just caught up that was a conversation about gender identity on here, that if someone's asking to be called by, say a gender neutral pronoun like they or them, then I think it's my job to honor that. And, or if someone is misgendering me, that's a term for saying, I'm a cisgender male, means identify with the gender as assigned at birth. Someone is calling me by she pronouns and that I don't go by that, then I would ask someone to respect that I use he, his pronouns. We can create spaces also in our meetings and whatnot to share our name and what pronouns we prefer. So those are some options. We could really unpack this over a day-long webinar.
It's a big topic.
But again, the tools work. It's just about using that I statement with offensive comments in this case, but then ongoing education. We should all be engaging ourselves in ongoing education. And this group is self-selected into education, so that gives me confidence that you'll go do that.
Yeah, totally. And I can speak, from my experience as, as a gay man, if there are things that are homophobic, I always have to ask myself, is it worth it in this situation? Like what are the stakes right here in this moment? And sometimes, I have to decide that it's not worth that. I need to use my energy to go do something else or to have a different conversation. Yeah. I can try to educate this person, and if I am failing at that or if it's not coming through, then at a certain point I have to cut my losses and just be like, all right, on to the next. But again, that may not be applicable in all situations, but I find myself having to ask that question a lot. Is this worth it? Is this the battle I want to fight, or am I going to let this not take it seriously and roll it off my back and just go on about my business somewhere else? And I understand there's some difficulty around that, but
yeah. And then I would add, Calvin, you probably have found yourself, you ask yourself, that there's a moment where I need to ask help from an ally, meaning is there someone, a heterosexual person in the workplace that might act as my ally? Because I'm too triggered by this. So, and then asking for that support.
For sure. All right, so we have just a couple minutes left. I'll see if anyone's on the phone. Operator, do we have anyone on the phone?
And we're showing no questions from the phone.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's do, I think we have time for about 2 more questions. I can answer this one pretty quickly. One says, the grantee is asking us for things which violate AmeriCorps statutes. Is it the leader's place to point this out to either or question marks? They didn't finish, but if you are being asked to do things that directly go against AmeriCorps VISTA policy or regulations, you should not do that work. It's okay for you to refuse to do it, because then you are sort of in some sort of way making yourself complicit and and breaking those regulations by continuing to do it. You don't have to do that work. Your supervisor cannot fire you for not doing something that you're not supposed to be doing. It's perfectly fine. I think it's a good moment, to have that conversation. If you are noticing this, you can bring that up to your state office. You can email them. You can call them. you can bring that up to your supervisor and say, hey, I'm not supposed to be doing this based on this regulation. I really need you to respect that. If you can't, then we need to have a conversation, between you and our state office to try to figure out where we can course correct, because I can't do this work. I think that's you're totally within your rights as an AmeriCorps member to do that. And let's see. All right, so we have one last question from Kimberly. Says, what do you do when your supervisor wants you to do one thing, but your coworker, who is his wife, tells you that you are doing it wrong? How could you go about it when both of them have power over you but are saying different things? I think in this situation, to me, it's a little. I mean, I know it's hazy as the person that's going through it, but one of them is your supervisor and one of them isn't. I mean, that's sort of like that's the situation, and I think it's okay to express that also. Say, hey, I appreciate your feedback on this, but I have a supervisor and it is this person. I really need to respect the things that they tell me, because they are ultimately in control of my work and the things that I have to do. Again, if you have feedback for me, please, I'd love to hear it. I'll take it into account, but understand that this is the person that I have to report to.
Yeah, I defer to you on that, but I also would concur with that. That seems like the approach I would take.
Yeah.
But I can appreciate the challenge in that.
Oh, well, 100%. That sounds like it's really tricky to navigate. It's either you have to go through that.
Yeah, totally.
Totally. Carol Saldivar says, focus on the mission of our projects. That's an excellent note, and that's a good note to end on. At the end of the day, we should all be focused on the mission of our projects. So thank you so much, Mike, for the excellent presentation. Do you have any final parting words for us?
No, thank you. As you were talking, it was great to kind of catch up with all the great chatting going on. I think good conversation. Good luck, everyone, and hope that try one of these tools out that we just offered up. Just try one in the next week or even the next day. It will help get it become body memory. Thank you all.
Hey, thank you so much. Before we go, please join us for our next webinar, which is Generating In-Kind Contributions for Your Organization. That's on December 18th at the same time, same place. You'll receive an email about it, or you can find the link to that on the VISTA webinars page on the VISTA campus. If you have any questions that we weren't able to get to today, or if you would like to do any follow-up, you can email us at vistawebinars@cns.gov, and we will follow up with you. Probably me personally, I'll follow up with you. So shoot your questions over there, or any comments or feedback that you have. And that being said, thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.